Good morning, students. Today, in lecture number 10, we are again going to discuss William Wordsworth's concept of poetry. Because this concept of poetry is a detailed analysis of William Wordsworth's concept of poetry, which he mentions in his preface to Lyrical Parallel. In the previous lecture, we have seen that how poetry functions or the function of poetry, how it gives messages man to man and so on. And today, after this function of poetry, we will discuss that poetry is the pursuit of truth. Poetry stands for truth. Poetry is the pursuit of truth. There are so many disciplines in the world, but poetry is one discipline that talks about the truth. And we have seen that in the previous discussion of concept of poetry that poetry gives pleasure. It stands for moral. It is permanent. And here we are going to discuss that poetry is the pursuit of truth and as well knowledge also. So whatever the extreme good ideal for that poetry stands, means poetry stands for knowledge, truth, philosophy, moral and permanence. So, and pleasure as well. But there are so many disciplines, though they couldn't give such type of things which poetry gives. So, in the pursuit of truth, we will going to discuss that the poetry, according to William Wordsworth, also is the pursuit of truth, of man's knowledge of himself and the world around him, of man's knowledge of himself and the world around him. Means poetry talks about the knowledge of man and the knowledge of the world which revolves, moves and centers around him. So the truth that poetry tries to collect around the universe, around the mankind, or the man's knowledge of himself and the knowledge of the man around him, means the world man. So poetry definitely tries to collect the knowledge of the world, because it is considered whatever the good it try to bring forth, try to bring it on the surface, try to explore, so that its main purpose is to make mankind knowledgeable, pleasurable, and we can simply say moral. After that, the poet compares poetry with science, because poetry and science both discovers the things, but the science makes man materialistic, and while poetry gives pleasure, happiness and worldly philosophy that science failed to give. So he compares that science is engaged in the same pursuit too. He compares poetry with science. Science finally explains that how poetry is superior than the science, though both have the invention. Science is engaged the science is also truth too. Science also takes the form of truth, like the poetry, but while the truth is discovered, but while the truth is while the truth is discovered, benefit us only materially. Benefit us only material means material benefit means in the form of money. But when the truth poetry explores about the worldly pleasure, it gives man a wide philosophy. Man becomes ideal, moral, pleasurable, sound, balanced, and he is the unique one. Becomes the saintly image one. But while science is also engaged in the pursuit of truth, means finding the truths, new things, innovation, exploration, creativity. But while the truth is discovered, benefits of material. Because when you discover something through the help of science, you will be awarded with prosperity, money, and so on. But in the case of poetry, you will get pleasure, happiness, and also the knowledge of the universe. So he further says, but the truth of poetry, when he talks about the truth of poetry comparing to the science, he says, but the truth of poetry cleave to us, but the truth of poetry cleave to us means we can say naturally gives. It gives natural line or naturally gives. We can simply say cleave means it naturally gives to us as a necessary part of our existence. As a necessary part of our existence. So, when we compare or when the Wordsworth compares between the poetry and truth, we will come to know that when the science also does or follow the pursuit of truth, but while the truth is discovered, benefits material means man's get the benefit in the form of money. But when the poetry is considered as the pursuit of truth, poetry cleaves to us means poetry naturally gives to us a necessary part of our existence. What we need the man for his existence, for to become an ideal man, good man, spiritual man, that poetry gives, where science failed to give such knowledge of existence, but it gives the money. Further says that the poets, he says, for they concern man's relation to man, means poetry concerns man's relations to man, but when we talk about the science, it never concerns to the relations of man, but it is only concerned of himself. In the case of materiality. So, the poetry here, the purpose of explaining or comparing this poetry with science or poet with the scientist is that invention is at the two level. Yes, invention is in both the cases, but the poetry is superior than the science. Further says that for they concern means the poet concerns, he says, for they concerns poets concerns man's relation to man. man's relation to man. Man's relation to man means it is stand for humanity and human existence. On one hand, it stands man's relation to man and his relation to the external world of nature on the other hand. Of nature on the other means when he compares the science, then he comes to the poetry and says it stands for the human existence, and he further says poet concerned man's relation to man, means it is for the development, construction of humanity and to bring the harmony in society on one hand, and his relation to the external world of nature on the other hand. When the poet makes the natural things with the human and human with the nature, then the balance remains. And so man gets affinity, importance of the nature, and nature is automatically reserved by the man. So the beauty of the nature, secret of the nature, everything will be open, and man so goes very much close to the nature. The external world and the relation to man both illustrates. Then he said both illustrates incidents and situations from common life. Here again compares between the means both talks about science and poetry. So he says both poetry and science illustrate incident and situations from common life. Incident and situations from common life. While man harms man, the world of nature. While in science, man harms man. Where in science or through science or science means here, by the advancements of the science, man harms man. In the case of anything we have seen there, when the advancement goes on, the man harms man. Means through this advanced weapon, through this advanced invention, man is totally suffered, injured. So man is harmed to man, or man harms to man in science. He says, or through science he says, the world of nature which everything is happy. And while he says, while in poetry everything is happy. While in poetry everything is happy, caters for his hourly delight. Caters for delight, or delight means happiness. Caters for the delight means in science man harms to man, but in poetry man gives happiness or delight. So this the idea of William Wordsworth. Though both poetry also is a medium of invention and science too, but both aim is invention, creation, development, progress. But here he says, which Wordsworth says that, but in both the cases, in science, man runs behind the money when he has done something new, creative. But in the case of when something is invented by the poet, he gets pleasure, happiness, and we can say happiness of or sound of mind and body. So this is, he says, in the poetry, man's relation with man is developed on one hand, and his relation to the external world on the other hand. Means along with man's nature with the man and relation to the man, also he came into contact with the external world, and also we have seen that how the science gives us the materialism. Man, science makes us materialistic, follow the money by the innovation, while poetry stands to give naturally or natural things as necessary things which are required for the existence of human being, that are given by the poetry, not by science. And here he says both science and poetry. Poetry illustrates incidents and situations from common life, while in science or while studying science, through science, by science or its innovation, man harms to man. Man harms to man, and while in poetry everything is happy, caters for delight, means hourly delight. So this is science gives harm, while poetry stands for happy, caters for hourly delight. This is the idealness of poetry, which science fails to give. And again, when we talk about this, comparison between the two, Wordsworth further says, while the pursuit of science pleases the scientist, there is nothing in its truth that can equally please the common man. Because pursuit of science, he says, pursuit of science pleases the scientist. Pleases the pursuit of science pleases the scientist. There is nothing in its truth that can equally pleases the common man. Because science never pleases the common man, which the poetry does. And at the same time, the science does stand for the pursuit of truth like the poetry, but it pleases the only scientist who develops something, who invents something. But there is nothing in truth that can equally pleases the common man. But when the poet invents something, not only it pleases the scientist, it pleases the poet for his exploration of the nature, human being, mankind, everything, but it also gives pleasure to the common man, and through it he learns a lot. There must remain the pleasure of the few who know science. Means it only talks about the pleasing place of scientists or who know only science. Who know only science, they become pleasurable, means happy. But in the case of poetry, he says, and in the case of poetry, Wordsworth says, poetry therefore is the bread, because poetry pleases each and every common man compared to the science. So he simply said, poetry is the breadth and final spirit of knowledge. Is the breadth and final spirit of knowledge. It is impassioned expressions. It is impassioned expressions. Expressions which is in the contents of science. Contents of science means science failed to give what things that poetry gives. So poetry, though it makes the invention, but it on the terms of material, and though it is gives the pursuit of truth like poetry, though we say, but it gives nothing than the truth, and it makes pleasure only to the science or who know a little bit about the science or to the scientist. But in the case of poetry, we have seen it stands for human existence. It gives pleasure and also the hourly delight. And poetry therefore is the breadth of everything and final spirit of knowledge. It gives a spirit of knowledge. It is impassioned expressions which the science would give. So this way, William Wordsworth, through this concept of poetry, very well highlights, proves, come to the conclusion that poetry is superior form other than in disciplines of knowledge, invention, and so on. So, with this brief information about the concept of poetry, I stop here. Tomorrow again we will discuss the further part of concept of poetry. With this brief information about concept of poetry and comparison between the poetry and science, how poetry proved as a superior form than science, that Wordsworth very well depicts and preface to Lincoln Bell. With this, I thanks. I stop here. Thank you.